Hi, I'm Todd Barnes with Omega Custom Tackle, and today we're going to be fishing one of my favorite lures of all times, the Omega Jig. The Omega Jig is available in two sizes, the 5/16 ounce finesse version and the 7/16 ounce pitch and jig. Little guy. With the sun being as high as it is, you have to be able to get the bait way up underneath the docks in those real dark shady areas. That's where those fish are going to go when it's sunny. When it's overcast or cloudy or you have a lot of wind, they'll get out on these flats and they'll roam. You can catch them on a buzz bait, a swim jig, something like that. But when that sun gets real high, those fish, they duck up underneath there. We've designed the Omega Jig here on Lake of the Ozarks, and this jig is designed to skip. It's a small profile jig, so you get a lot of bites, but we catch a lot of big fish on this bait as well. This is a 7/16 ounce. It's heavy enough. I'm throwing it on 20-pound fluoro, 7-foot heavy action rod. You can put the steel to them and you can move them. Another good thing about this jig is when it settles, I'll skip that jig up into that shady area and I'll let it sit. And when that jig hits, it'll hit, it'll rock down, and then it kind of pivots and rocks back into place. And if there's a fish just sitting there looking at them, a lot of times you get a bite before you ever move the bait. Something else, if you'll notice, when I get that jig up underneath there, I never engage the reel right away. You don't want it to pendulum back towards the boat. You want that jig to fall straight down. A lot of times if we're fishing shallow, fairly shallow today, but a lot of times if I'm fishing deeper docks, I'll go ahead and I'll feed line off and let that jig fall on slack line. Oh. There's a little keeper right there. Drilled him right in the top of the head. It's a good thing about that jig, the way it's balanced and the way it sits. When it falls, it does not lay over on its side like a lot of ball head jigs do. This jig, when it hits, it's balanced perfectly and it sits straight up like that. Nice little keeper there. So when that jig hits, it's sitting like this on the bottom. It's not laying over. And when that fish picks it up, it gets drilled right in the top of the head every time. That was on the 7/16 watermelon red with the 5-inch Yamamoto twin tail. That's probably about my favorite setup there. Oh. Boy, he's on fire. Another keeper. Be still. It's on that 7/16 watermelon red. That one I actually started bringing the jig back and popping it. And a lot of times you can get a reaction strike, and that's why a lot of guys will stick with a 1/4 ounce or a 5/16, which they're awesome jigs, and I've caught a ton of fish on them too. But with that 7/16, if you're kind of popping it and jerking it and everything, it falls quicker and you'll get a lot more reaction strikes. Okay. Another keeper. He was way up underneath that dock, getting shot at here. He was way up underneath there. That's another keeper. Little piece of brush. Come on. Oh, son. Here he comes. Spitting up shad. Look at that. Come here, young man. Another keeper. Catch a lot of keepers. Hear that jig pop? Just another good quality keeper. That's on the 7/16 Omega. A lot of times too, I think with the skipping technique, especially when these fish are shallow, you know, and they're looking up or they're feeding up, they see that jig skipping across the water, and it might even mimic a shad. I know you're fishing a jig, you know, and you're trying to kind of mimic either a crawfish or a bluegill, but I think a lot of times that skipping sound, they hear that and they'll look up, and then phew, here comes that jig, and you get a lot of reaction strikes that way. And this isn't it is a small bait, but it's not a small fish bait. I mean, I've caught some giant largemouth and smallmouth as well, especially down south on the Tennessee River where there's a lot of big smallmouth. Man, they eat this thing up. And I think what it does, it just mimics the size of crawfish. You know, crawfish, yay big. I mean, it's just, the jig is the perfect size. And that's what most of the time these fish are feeding on. When they feed on crawfish, occasionally you'll catch them and they've got big giant crawdads, but the crawdads they eat day in, day out are about that same size. So just does a real good job of mimicking the crawfish. Perfect example right here. Look at the pontoon right there. You can't be afraid to get the jig hung up, you know, because that's where the fish are. They're way up underneath that stuff. Another keeper. Like taking that Yamamoto, biting about 4 rings off. This is the 5-inch twin tail grub. Thread it on there nice and straight. Come out right before the tail section. We designed the Omega jig here on Lake of the Ozarks. There's a lot of tournaments here, a lot of fishing pressure, and we had to have a bait that we could get way up underneath the docks and catch fish, you know, due to either weather system moving through or a lot of fishing pressure. And we had to have a bait that, number one, that we could get through the rock, because there's a ton of rock here. We had to have a bait that we could get through the timber. There's a ton of brush. A lot of the dock owners will put brush around their docks. They catch crappie and brim and bass out of them. So we had to have a bait that could, you know, number one, get through the rock. Number two, get through the brush. And most importantly, number three, that we could get way up underneath the docks where a lot of guys cannot and don't even try to put a bait.